We don't have Tillman. Tillman? You ready? We have Dr. Tillman. We have Dr. Thomas. We don't have me. Okay. Well, welcome, folks, to the afternoon session. We're going to switch gear a little bit now and go to sea otters. And we're all well familiar with a little sea otter. Back in the 17th century, they were up in the hundreds of thousands and then were decimated through hunting. I think the early 20th century, we were down to maybe a few thousand individuals, and the first protection kicked in 1911 under the International Fur Seal Treaty. So sea otters are now protected under the MMPA and the ESA, and many populations have recovered. So the real intent of this afternoon is to hear about the current status of sea otter populations in California, Washington, and Southeast Alaska, and then explore how they fit within their ecosystems and some of the science behind fisheries interactions of those subpopulations. So we have a great panel for the afternoon. Here we have Dr. Tim Tinker, representing USGS, proud owner of Nhydra, Inc., Deanna Lynch from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Jib Bodkin, USGS Emeritus. But we also have two other people who are on the webinar who will be on the panel and also presenting. So we have Lillian Carswell from California and for Fish and Wildlife Service, but for ease of presentation, her presentation will actually be given by Tim Tinker from USGS. And then we also have Laurie Poleshek from Alaska Department of Fish and Game, who will start off the fisheries interaction session. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Tim Tinker, and we're going to be doing a little bit of backwards and forwardsing throughout the PowerPoints to try and make things as seamless as possible.
All right. Thank you very much, Francis. I got to press a button.
Talk right into this.
Okay. It's not. I haven't. There we go. Okay, well, thank you very much. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground here, and hopefully relatively quickly. So we do have a lot of things to cover, so I'm going to jump right into it. This is a very long title: History, Population Structure, Demography, Threats, Trends, and Status Relative to Carrying Capacity in California, Washington, Southeast. And my first job is actually to provide a little bit of an overview of things we have learned about sea otter, population structure, and demography that will be relevant to interpreting the status and trends in these three different places. So we're going to start with a little bit of a history session, which actually Francis already covered a little bit, and then we will move on to their demography. And nothing's happening with the buttons. Here we go. Okay, so overview of the history. Prior to the fur trade in 1750, the distribution of sea otters is, as you see in this map, stretching from the North Island, Japan, Hokkaido, through the Kuril Islands, and Aleutian Islands, and down the west coast of North America to Baja Peninsula. And they were relatively continuous through this range, that changed beginning in 1750 with the North Pacific fur trade. Between 1750 and 1911, sea otters were virtually wiped to extinction. By the time they're protected by international treaty in 1911, there were just a handful of these small remnant colonies scattered across their former range. On this map, everywhere you see a little red dot is somewhere we think there was a remnant colony. In some cases, just a dozen or so animals. So really, there's probably less than 1,000 animals worldwide. However, that protection was extremely effective, and over the next century, the worldwide population did begin to recover, but in a very piecemeal fashion, depending on where these remnant colonies were left over. So for instance, by the 1970s, many areas still had not been recolonized yet, but some areas were already at carrying capacity, for instance, in the Aleutian Islands. So these place names you see in the map here show some of the places that we've conducted studies of sea otter populations. Based on the most recent estimate by Jim Bodkin, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 125,000 sea otters currently distributed across the range that you see here. And much of their former range has now been recolonized, but there are still significant areas of range that they have yet to recolonize. Of that 125,000, approximately 32,000 resulted from 4 successful translocations of 708 individual animals about 50 years ago. So the populations in Southeast Alaska, Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and Washington State are all the results of these successful translocations. And as you will see, these populations have grown very well. And so it appears that translocation has been, at least in the past, a successful way of conserving this population. Here you see the rates of recovery of a bunch of different populations on log-transformed axis. And the main thing to take away from this slide is that different populations recovered at quite different rates. And this was a little bit of a mystery. The paper referenced at the bottom, Bodkin et al. 1999, it was pointed out that the translocated populations actually seem to have grown and recovered at rates substantially higher than some of the historically remnant populations, such as in the Aleutian Islands, California, and Prince William Sound. But it still remained a mystery why some populations grew fast, why some populations didn't seem to grow so fast. We now believe that a great deal of this mystery is not a mystery at all, but actually reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the scale at which sea otter populations operate that all of us had really been laboring under for many years, and confusion over really what a sea otter population was. So I'm going to cover this very quickly right now, but we think this is an extremely important topic in terms of going forward with management and conservation of sea otters and the issues that we're currently facing. Population growth and regulation in sea otters, as with many apex predators, is determined by some limiting resource, in this case their prey resources. Occasionally other factors, but usually populations ultimately reach carrying capacity as a result of prey limitation. The key question, though, is what is the scale at which this occurs? In earlier days, we tended to look at this at the scale of these huge regional populations, entire stocks. And we'd pose the question, was this stock, California, Southeast Alaska, at K or near K? And we now understand that that was actually a very bad way of thinking of it. Sea otters have extremely small home ranges, particularly females, the demographically relevant part of the population, tend to spend their entire reproductive lives within a stretch of coast maybe 10 to 20 kilometers long. They'll never leave that stretch of coastline. So you can see that Monterey Peninsula, there's a lifetime home range for one adult female that we've tracked over about 15 years, so her entire life. And that one stretch of Monterey Peninsula is all she's ever seen. Sea otter populations are regulated locally both because of the high site fidelity of females, also because of the very fine-scale variation in their prey. They're not feeding on pelagic prey or fisheries. They're feeding on benthic invertebrates that vary in abundance and productivity, sometimes at the scale of meters, but certainly at the scale of several kilometers. So it's possible to have a population at K that's 2 or 3 times the density of another population at K only 50 kilometers away. And the reproductive females in those two populations never meet each other. They don't interact at all. Genes may flow by individual males, but the demographic scale at which population regulation occurs is really some tens to at most 50 kilometers of coastline. This applies everywhere. So we used to think of regional sea otter populations like this. They would grow rapidly when they were at very low densities, and then the growth rate would slow as the population reached carrying capacity. We thought this would occur at the scale of California or Southeast Alaska. We now understand that this is wrong, and it was this perception of things was why we thought some populations were growing faster than others. When we actually look at it at the scale at which populations actually operate, we find an incredible consistency in the rate of growth and the population dynamics of sea otters. They grow about exactly the same rate of growth at low population density, and that rate of growth slows until they reach zero at carrying capacity, but this just happens in these small subpopulations. So how we now think about populations is more of a metapopulation structured at relatively fine scale. So at the regional level, you still see a pattern of overall regional metapopulation growth and range expansion, but different parts of that metapopulation are experiencing very different demographic conditions. Uncolonized habitat is colonized, but the rate of colonization depends on mobility of sea otters, which is quite slow. Or it's quite low. They're not very mobile, as I have already mentioned, and that means that the rate of colonization can be relatively slow, particularly along unidimensional coastlines like Washington and California. Then you have other recently colonized areas that are going to be growing near our max, and that's really consistent at about 0.2. And then you have long-established subpopulations, which can in some cases be quite nearby these rapidly growing populations, and their population is limited. These populations here will be limited ultimately by their prey resources. So this picture is supported both by, 30 years of demographic studies that we've conducted using tagged animals and studies across our entire range, California, Alaska, Washington, British Columbia, Russia. And also a recent genetic analysis. There's a paper that just came out, actually. I think the early edition is out, showing again that this genetic variation by distance happens at relatively small scales with sea otters. The relevance for conservation and management, population regulation, as I said a couple times, but I want to hammer this home, occurs locally, not regionally. The effective density of carrying capacity varies by habitat and prey productivity, not surprising. Non-density dependent threats, though, can also have very strong local effects, again, because the regional populations are not these well-mixed populations, but are regulated at very small scales. And so that means that whether it's fishing entanglement or harvest or oil spills, any sort of direct mortality can be catastrophic at local scales, but not actually affect otters in other areas. And the Prince William Sound oil spill was a great example of that. So, so that's sort of the backdrop of our sort of a current understanding of how sea otter populations work spatially. So I'm now going to segue to applying this to the first area that we'll be looking at, which is California. Here we see, with this newfound knowledge, we can now make sense of the great variation we see in growth rates across the range. So here you see California. The colored band along the coast is the current population. And as you can see, the areas of orange and red in the center of the range are areas that for decades showed almost no growth, no population growth at all. They were stable, fluctuating around this sort of single abundance. And then several 50 kilometers away, you had areas that were growing quite rapidly at the range peripheries, as you can see from this graph here. And that's because from tagging studies we've done, we now realize there's no exchange of females and only occasional exchange of males between these areas. And the variety of other indices that we looked at, including proportion of time spent feeding. Here you see two populations, Big Sur and Monterey, in the center of the range, and then two subpopulations at the range, southern range periphery, Santa Barbara Channel and San Nicolas Island. See very different proportions of time spent feeding, with animals really maxing out at about 50% of their time spent feeding in the center of the range, still, but spending much less time feeding in the range peripheries. Body condition, particularly among females, was very different between these areas. Females are in very poor condition in the range center. They're very good condition at the range peripheries where food is abundant. Differences in condition, in fact, turn into differences in survival. So the range peripheries, we had very high survival where females were in excellent condition, and much lower survival rates in the range center where females were in poor condition. And in addition to these graphs here, there's several other studies found that increases in dive depths and duration of feeding dives in the center of the range where animals are more food limited. The incidence of something we call end lactation syndrome, which is basically females near the end of pup lactation dying just because they are so nutritionally stressed and subject to infections and various other causes of death, is quite high in the center of the range. So all these different industries suggested that these subpopulations in the range center were basically at carrying capacity, even though they were not very far away from areas that were still growing quite rapidly. So just when we figured we had it all sort of sorted out, everything changed. So starting around 2013, these trends suddenly changed. The center of the range began to grow quite rapidly, and the populations at both the northern and southern periphery of the range began to decline. This did not sort of match the picture that we had that was beginning to emerge. However, we do believe we know what's going on. It was not, as we initially thought, movement of animals. We had tagging studies going on showing that this was not a redistribution of animals. What was going on, though, was in the aftermath of the sea otter wasting disease, where pretty much 100% of Pycnopodia, the large urchin-eating sea stars, died throughout California and actually right up to southeast Alaska. But particularly in California, there's 100% mortality. We still don't have Pycnopodia back. There was a change in urchin distribution and behavior. Basically, these urchin fronts, for the first time in 50 years, came out and began to graze down the kelp around Monterey Peninsula. And we saw this really rapid response of sea otters, an increase in both the proportion of their diet from urchins, about tripled the proportion of the diet made up by urchins, and the size of the urchins they were eating also greatly increased. So the rate of energy gain skyrocketed in these areas of these new urchin barrens, and we saw a population response, particularly increased juvenile survival. So this is what we call in Monterey these urchin millennials. We saw them begin to appear around 2014, and the size of the population around the peninsula almost doubled. So that's what was going on in the range, or is still going on really in the range center, although in some areas it looks like this sort of glut of urchins is beginning to wear down, and we're starting to see increased mortality again. Meanwhile, at the range peripheries, what seemed to go on was quite different. We didn't see the same increase in urchin abundance, but what we did see is a dramatic increase in shark bite mortality. That really began in the early 2000s, but has continued to increase right through to the present day. At the north end of the range, it's always been relatively high. Around 50 to 60% of the animals that die up there die of shark bite. The south end of the range, it had traditionally been low, only about 3 to 5%, but this has now increased. And so from the southern third of the range, currently about 60 to 70% of the animals that die from shark bite mortality. And this is essentially curtailing population growth at the range ends. This map here simply just shows a hotspot analysis showing where the mortality is occurring. And it's, as you can see, the hotspots are at the northern and southern peripheries. This is effectively shutting down population range expansion in California. So finally, to wrap up California, here is the current abundance. The population for the entire combined range, San Nicolas Island and the mainland range, surpassed the recommended delisting threshold for the first of 3 necessary years 2 years ago. It was above it again last year, although as you can see, the population actually did dip a little bit, reflecting both that shark bite mortality and also perhaps the little bit of the end of some of the urchin millennials. And now, if it surpasses the threshold for a 3rd year during this next survey, which is going on right now, then probably that will trigger the initiation of consideration for delisting. So we might be at an auspicious time for sea otters in California. But I'm now going to switch to Washington.
Thanks, Tim. So give you a quick update on Washington sea otters. They primarily are occurring along our outer coast range within about an 80-mile stretch that extends from Cape Flattery down to the Point Grenville area. We also get a handful of sea otters that are reported in through the Straits of Juan de Fuca and down into South Puget Sound. And then they also have a few animals that have wandered down the coastline of Oregon as far south as Cape Arago. In 2017 is our most recent population estimate, and that we counted 2,058 otters. This population has been growing at about an average rate of increase of 9.5% per year since 1989. However, when we break the coastline down between a north and south end, which is our rocky habitat versus a mixed and sandy habitat, we do see a quite different rate of growth in population, where it's at about 5% in the rocky habitat, the area that they've occupied for the longest, but it's at a 22% growth rate down in the sandy mixed habitat. So we might be approaching the carrying capacity in the north end, but I think it's pretty clear that we are not anywhere remotely close to carrying capacity for the whole population, or at least in the south end in particular. In addition to having an unequal growth rate, we also have a pretty unequal distribution across that range. Up until about 2002, most of the population occurred in the northern portion of the range, but then since then, and by now, in our last count in 2017, about 80% of the population is in the southern portion in that sandy mixed habitat area. There's almost 3 times the amount of adults, but if you can see here on the slide, that there's about an equal number of pups between the north and the south end. So I think that we're seeing our reproduction occurring in the north end where most of the females are, and then the animals are dispersing to the south, supplementing that growth. So I don't think we're actually getting that level of reproduction in the south end. It's being supplemented by otters in the north end. However, that whole lot of otters down in that south end doesn't necessarily going to equate to a higher density, because in this area, these otters are not equally distributed. Here's a really good example in this photo of a group that we have been photographing for many, many years now in the south end. It makes the World Wide Web almost every year. This particular photo was taken in 2016. It's a really large raft that occurs in open water. It was 685 animals, and it was a group of males with females with pups. So that's something that's a bit unusual in our population. We don't generally see mixed groups either. So they're not necessarily equally distributed, so if we were to try and apply and do what we need to do for density estimates to get carrying capacities, that southern end is going to be a little bit tricky, because this particular group accounted for almost half of the otters counted in the southern portion of the range. So a lot of empty water as well as one really large group. So that makes our life a little bit complicated when we try and consider what we're going to do for carrying capacity. So right now, I don't think that we actually have the information that we need to develop a viable carrying capacity. There's been a couple of previous efforts done by Kristen Lydra. However, that was done before we really saw our exponential growth in the southern portion of the range. And it also, within that area, like I said, a sandy habitat they relied on California estimates that were done, and I don't think that's really a very appropriate use for Washington. As we can see, I think we're not food limited, where the California otters that it was based on actually are food limited. So I don't think it's really appropriate for us to be using the current estimates of carrying capacity that were developed. So we need more information. That's what we are asked to bring to you guys, and what do we think we need. I think we definitely have to have more information on what prey is available and how otters are using the area. And then I also think we need to understand a little bit better on how and why they're not expanding their range farther south into habitat that, at least to us, appears very similar, or into the Straits of Juan de Fuca. They've occupied almost the same areas since we began surveys in 1989, are not expanding their range, and we don't really have a good understanding of why. So that kind of leads us to, we can't do a carrying capacity or determine what they're at with optimal sustainable population. But we also wanted to find out a little bit about what is going on with this population. So in 2002, we established a stranding program to look at what are the sources of mortality in this group. And by and far, the leading source was infectious disease, and the primary culprit is Sarcocystis neurona. That accounted for more than 50% of the otters that we examined as the cause of death. We've also seen a lot of bacterial and viral infections and a variety of other sources of mortality, some of which are human-caused, such as oiling and drowning, some severe head trauma wounds from boat strikes, and some gunshot wounds. Tim was referring to the shark bites in California being very food limited. In the last 15 years since I've been working on this, we've had a total of 2 shark bites, and those were both in otters that were down at Newport, Oregon. The conclusion that we drew from all of our sources of mortality was that it's not really a significant effect to the population. It's not slowing down its growth at all, and it's also not limiting their ability to expand their range, because none of these are specific to an area. It goes throughout the whole population, no matter where we're at. We see these sources of mortality. We were asked to present what we thought were our threats and emerging issues, and I think by far the biggest threat to this population is that it's concentrated in a pretty small area, and it's going to increase that risk to catastrophic events such as oil spills or a disease that goes through the population. They'll be much more vulnerable because they're so concentrated in a small area. We also, in that area, have a lot of fisheries that are potentially interacting with them, in particular Dungeness crab and razor clam fisheries, both commercial and recreational. And as those populations expand farther, our population expands farther south, they're going to become even more overlapping with these fisheries. So I think we need to understand those a little bit better. And in the near future, I think we're going to start seeing an issue with being able to figure out what our population estimates are, partly because of funding, but mostly because of retirement of experienced personnel. Right now, our population estimates is really relying on one person who's going to retire after next year. So we don't have a lot of people replacing him, and so that's going to potentially pose a problem for us to get information on this population. But the biggest information need I think we have is fisheries information and understanding those commercial and recreational fisheries that are overlapping with the otters, and in particular bycatch that might be associated with the Dungeness crab fishery. Jim, you're up.
Thanks, Deanna. So I'm going to talk about Southeast Alaska and the status and trends of sea otters in Southeast Alaska. The current population size in Southeast Alaska is probably on the order of 30,000 animals. The most recent estimate was in 2012 of approximately 25,000 animals. And this represents about 20% of the North Pacific sea otter population, and resulting from, 5 translocations about 50 years ago, 403 animals. And so obviously there's been a huge increase in the abundance of sea otters in Southeast Alaska over the past 50 years. So a little background, I'm going to show some slides of the trends in abundance over time represented by these areas in this slide. All of Southeast Alaska, southern Southeast Alaska, northern Southeast Alaska, and Glacier Bay. And these are going to be done basically to illustrate the differences in the growth rates over time and amongst these different locations. So this is the first series of data. This goes from this time the animals were introduced in 1969 up until 2010 or 2012. There was a period of 3 years when these surveys were done. And with an annual growth rate of approximately 12% a year. That growth rate 20 years ago was about 20% a year. So we've seen a decline in that growth rate over the past couple of decades. But nonetheless, clearly an increasing population. And we'll take that one. So now we're looking just southern Southeast Alaska, and over about a 10-year period, 8-year period from 2003 to 2010. And this is a period when identical survey methodologies were employed. And so this is the only kind of 2 consistent survey methods and the only 2 data points from that. So you'll see this for southern Southeast Alaska and northern Southeast Alaska, as well as some of the further analysis that we did to look at structuring within Southeast Alaska at a finer scale. And in southern Southeast Alaska, we had a growth rate of about 13% during this period. And in northern Southeast Alaska, with the exception of Glacier Bay, we had a growth rate that was about half of that, about 7%. But if we look just at Glacier Bay, we've seen a growth rate in Glacier Bay since it was recolonized in about 1993. The growth rate has been over 40% since that time, but the annualized growth rate since 1999 is now at about 27%. So, I mean, the bottom line is that sea otters are faring fairly well throughout Southeast Alaska. But we've been asked to look at what the carrying capacity might be and what's the relationship between sea otter abundance there now and what it might be in the future. So a paper that was recently submitted by Tinker and his colleagues, basically it was a state space model to survey data, to use survey data to estimate K at sub-regional levels. There's no habitat covariates involved in this model, but we do use true abundance estimates that are corrected for detection. And we also account for harvest mortality because there is a subsistence harvest that occurs throughout parts of Southeast Alaska. So the results of this exercise illustrated 24 distinct subpopulations, if you will, within Southeast Alaska, represented in this figure by each of these different colors. And demographically distinct in the sense that the growth rates and therefore the underlying demographic rates in the populations must be varying. So this is a plot of those growth rates in each of those subregions within within Southeast Alaska as a whole. And you can see that over time they decline. Some of the growth rates early on in the early stages are far beyond what you might expect from reproduction alone, suggesting that there is movement of animals into new habitats that are accounting for those large growth rates. but that after about 20 years or so, we start to see growth rates that are down, approaching zero, and in some cases slightly below zero. So this is kind of the evidence behind that sub-regional structuring of populations. And so it might be reasonable to think that this might be approaching the spatial scales that the populations are structured. And I'll say that amongst those 24 areas, I think the average area was about 400 square kilometers, and it ranged from about 100 up to about 900. So that might approximate, the spatial scale, or a range of spatial scales that populations might be structuring. And this exercise also calculated the carrying capacity in each of these subregions. And so each of these pie charts reflect the ratio of the current density to the carrying capacity density. So these pies with large amounts of orange represent subregions that still have room for growth and additional animals, and those that have small or large black areas, those are the areas that have potential for growth. The areas that are predominantly orange are at or near carrying capacity here. So you can look at these subregions and see that there's room for growth in many of those subregions. And I'm putting the wrong button all the time. So just in summary, it was really the uncompromised habitat that was available in southeast Alaska that facilitated the recovery of about half of the sea otter habitat in southeast Alaska at this time. As sea otters recover vacant habitat, population growth rates appear to diminish as populations approach their carrying capacity. And this is a prolonged process that can require decades to occur. The sea otter populations in southeast Alaska and elsewhere appear to be demographically structured at spatial scales on the order of hundreds of square kilometers of habitat, which is a pretty small area compared to what we traditionally viewed as sea otter populations. And recognizing the appropriate spatial scales at which populations are structured will enable more effective sea otter management and conservation. And as Tim hit upon, as well as Deanna, conducting surveys is a challenging endeavor, both in terms of costs and manpower. And as you might have noticed, they're relatively infrequent surveys. The last sea otter survey in southeast Alaska was 2012. There's been some partial ones that were conducted this year, but we don't have any comprehensive surveys since 2012. But Tim showed some data that's pretty compelling that suggests that energy recovery rates, or the amount of energy that a sea otter obtains while it's feeding, is a very accurate reflector of the status of that population, at least in terms of its relationship to food resources as a limiting resource. And I think that was about the end of it. And now I have to move over.
I can help you with that.
Okay. We're going to talk now about ecological interactions with sea otters. Now, it's really important to remember that what we think we know about sea otters today is largely an artifact of the situation that we found ourselves in over the past 50 years when we've been looking at sea otters, their biology and ecology. And it's important to remember that because what we've learned may not actually be reflected over the long term when sea otters populations, let's say, are at fully equilibrium throughout their range in the Pacific. But so with that caveat, I'll talk a little bit about what we think we know about sea otter interactions. And this situation where sea otters have been absent from large portions of their range and present in large portions of their range has been a great boon to our ability to look at the environment, at their ecosystems, in the absence of this predator, which has really helped us understand it and provided some really fundamental and widely recognized ecological relationships using sea otters in their nearshore communities. So most of the interactions between sea otters and their ecosystems occur as a result of what they eat. And of course, there's the direct effects. Sea otters prey on over 150 different species. Almost all of those are benthic invertebrates. And this is just a sample of some of the most common prey items, things from sea stars to crabs, clams, urchins, abalone, and octopus. And in general, we're fairly confident that sea otters have the capacity to maintain many of their prey populations in terms of the size distribution and their abundance and their biomass. And they can maintain those at levels that will be below what you might find in the absence of sea otters. So that, I think, is the bottom line in terms of the direct effects of sea otters on their ecosystems. But when we think about indirect effects, probably there's one great example, and you're probably all familiar with it, and I'm not going to go into great depth about that, and it has to do with the otter, the urchin, and the kelp paradigm. But essentially, what it states is that when sea otters are absent or rare in coastal nearshore marine ecosystems, that urchins are large and abundant, and they have a profound effect through their grazing activities on the species composition and the abundance of kelps and other macrophytes. And conversely, when sea otters are abundant in the system, that urchins are small, their grazing effects are restricted or non-existent, and kelps of a variety of different species become abundant. And as a result, we have a very different system. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that system and how it differs and some of the functions that system might provide that are different because of the presence of these macrophytes. And I use the term macrophytes rather than kelp forests because I want to emphasize that the kelps are not just those forests that you might see on the surface, but there's understory kelps, there's turf kelps, there's seagrass beds, there's a variety of different types of structures that are provided by this broader term of macrophytes, but kelp forest is a reasonable way to think about that. But what do these kelp forests, these macrophytes, provide? Well, structural complexity in a habitat, in a marine environment that wouldn't have any without those kelps. Those kelps can occur, up to 60 or 80 feet in water depth and can occur throughout the water column. Provides habitat diversity, and with that habitat diversity comes species diversity, as well as the elevation of some species, some members of these kelp forest communities that can become more abundant in the presence of kelps than they were in the absence. These kelp forests provide refugia. They provide a complementary source of primary productivity in the marine system, and this is something that is I don't think it's widely appreciated, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Food web subsidies from this nearshore system, both into the offshore system, as well as into the terrestrial systems, primarily through watersheds. These kelp forests can have strong influences on the hydrodynamics of coastal waters and currents. Large amounts of carbon can be sequestered in these kelp forests. So these are just a few of kind of the aspects of this indirect interaction between sea otters and their prey that add to our understanding of the role of sea otters in this nearshore system. So I'm going to talk briefly about a study that was fairly recently published that looked at the relative contribution of phytoplankton or microalgae compared to the kelps, the macrophytes that I was talking about earlier, and the contributions into the nearshore food web using two species of fish, a black rockfish, which is traditionally thought of as a fish that relies on forage fish as a base of its prey, as well as zooplankton, and then the kelp greenling, the bottom fish in here, which is a benthic species that relies on primarily small crustaceans in its diet. And what we did was we looked at, we sampled these fish from the Gulf of Alaska down to the Big Sur coast at these 7 different locations, 2 species of fish. And these pies represent the relative contribution of of carbon that was in the muscle of these fish that came from kelps, with the brown part of the pie, or from the phytoplankton, the green part of the pie. And what we see here is simply that most of the carbon in the muscle of both of these fish is derived from macroalgae, in some cases up to 90%. There was a couple of cases where phytoplankton was a bit more dominant, but in general, the kelp carbon was important to these fishes in this nearshore food web. And this is not novel work. Similar work has demonstrated the importance of kelp-derived carbon in many other nearshore taxa, including invertebrates, fishes, birds, and mammals, as well as the export of these kelps into the offshore systems and the upland systems. Now, I was asked to talk about ecological interactions in mixed sediment habitats, and there's not a fine distinction between rocky substrates and mixed sediment habitats, in that mixed sediment habitats can include boulders and cobbles that are largely immobile. So we see the same types of processes. Urchins occur in many of these mixed sediment habitats, these sheltered mixed sediment habitats, and we see the same response in these systems to the presence of otters in terms of reducing the abundance of urchins and a response in the kelp. So that same thing that we see in the rocky systems, we see that in sheltered mixed sediment habitats as well. This picture illustrates one of the effects that otters have in fine sediment habitats. So if you look closely, kind of at the center of the bottom of this image, you'll see two small dark objects, and those are otters. And these sediment plumes are the result of feeding sea otters. So they're excavating sediments, and in the process, these plumes are evident, and this was taken up in Prince William Sound. And it gives an example of some of the effects that sea otters might have in systems through this kind of ecosystem engineering of turning sediments over. We also see that sea otters alter the abundance and the size classes of infaunal bivalves, and the result is probably reflects modified filtration rates of seawater by these bivalves. And before I go on to the data slide looking at changes in clam abundance, I will say that we have very little data on the effects of otters on exposed open coastlines. It's simply we just haven't had we haven't taken the opportunity, if you will, to explore the relationships, and that's just simply a fact. But we're going to look here at the biomass of clam species at Glacier Bay sites as a result of increasing sea otter density. So these bars along the x-axis simply reflect edible biomass of clams that sea otters will consume, things like butter clams and little neck clams and Maya. And so these are just the range of biomass estimates that we found in Glacier Bay before sea otters were occupied. And then I'm just going to flash through the biomass estimates after sea otters had been there for about 15 years. And what we see is that two things. One of them is that sea otters recolonized areas where clams were most abundant, and they had an effect on those clams in terms of reducing their biomass. And this is just consistent with what we see throughout the sea otters range. So just a brief summary of ecological interactions in Southeast Alaska. The current status of sea otters and the nearshore marine ecosystems are an artifact of human activities over the past 250 years. And I think it's important that we continue to keep that in mind, and that what we think we learn may change over time. The direct effects of otter predation can include the maintenance of abundance, sizes, and biomass of their prey. And that could be below what you might expect or what you might find in their absence. And the indirect effects of reduced herbivory are documented across nearly every habitat that we've looked at. There's basically been no exceptions to that as sea otters recolonize new habitat and remove sea urchins. The restoration of kelp forests and other macrophytes have ecosystem level effects related to habitats and increased primary production. And our understanding of the long-term direct and indirect effects of sea otters are still incomplete. And again, I think that's in relation to the situation that we find ourselves in related to sea otters and their recovery and the relatively short duration that we've had to study it. So now I think we're going to move on to fisheries.
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, we're going to
Not
talk
yet.
about California interaction.
We're going to continue the ecological interactions a little bit, going south of Southeast Alaska. We're going to jump by Washington, not because sea otters don't have impacts in Washington or British Columbia for that matter, but just in the interest of time. But as Jim just mentioned, the studies that have been done in those areas have found similar or identical patterns and suggest that this is these are fairly broad phenomenon. In California, actually, one reason I want to actually cover the sea otter, urchin, kelp interactions in California, particularly Southern California, San Nicolas Island, is because there has been some debate, and particularly in the 1970s and 80s, there was a huge raging debate going on about whether this sort of keystone predator idea was something unique to Alaska and did not occur in California because the ecosystems were much more complex. So partially based on that debate and partially because there's an opportunity with the translocation of sea otters out to San Nicolas Island to collect some before and after data, a study was initiated in 1980 to see whether sea otters did indeed have an effect on the kelp forests in Southern California. This was a very long experiment, partially because most of the animals translocated to San Nicolas Island left San Nicolas Island almost immediately, and so the population, 125 otters were brought out, it dropped to about 12 animals. And so the population took a few decades to get to the level that sea otters would be having any, expected to have any measurable effect. One of the interesting things that happened that was not expected, and again now makes sense given what we know about sea otter behavior, is that the otters did not, even though this is a relatively small island, I'm not sure if there's a scale bar there. Yeah, so it's about 10 kilometers long. We expected the otters to use the entire island since we thought that wasn't very big. It turns out they don't. In fact, almost all the sea otters' utilization, both for resting and foraging, was the southwest corner of the island. And the color shading on this map is actually the urchin abundance prior to otters getting there. And it basically shows that otters went to where prey was most abundant, and then they stayed there. And they've hardly used other areas of the island at all. And we actually did the tagging study in the mid-2000s, and that was part of our evidence. We found that the animals, even at San Nicolas, had home ranges that were just a tiny, tiny little proportion of San Nicolas Island. It also, though, gave us the ability to look at variation in sea otter effects over very small scales. So the north side of the island, where sea otters occasionally go but basically spend almost no time, we have a nice time series of urchin abundance. That's what you see right here. Oh, I should have mentioned, so this ecological study involves going out twice a year, so there's been about 80 visits now over the last almost 40 years to do rigorous subtidal sampling of the communities at sites all the way around the island. So you can see that the abundance of both red urchins and purple urchins has varied quite a bit. We believe that most of these fluctuations have to do with crashes caused by urchin disease. But there's no relationship at all between the relocation of otters and the abundance of urchins. So these urchins are still cycling, cycles driven by disease dynamics with no effect of otters because the otters aren't there. And just over on the other side of the island, at the west end of the island where the otter population has been increasing, what we see is that otters are very prey, they tend to choose the most energy abundant prey, and red urchins have about 10 times the energy abundance as purple urchins. So otters ate almost no purple urchins prior to the early 2000s. They fed almost entirely on red urchins. You can see that red urchins declined pretty steadily in the presence of otters. By early 2000s, red urchins were at relatively low abundance, at least in these sites. There was a crash of purple urchins, probably driven by disease, but then it never recovered again because otters began to eat purple urchins. And what we saw was a really dramatic shift in the population structure from being urchin-dominated to kelp-dominated at the west end of the island. And after several years of really abundant macrocystis, we began to see for the first time a community state that we hadn't seen at all in San Nicolas as understory kelps and fleshy red algae became really abundant. So this basically finally answered the long-term debate about sea otters in California, that the keystone effect is not just an Alaskan or British Columbian thing. It applies in California, even Southern California. At the same time, we've been conducting studies in other habitats, and I'm going to touch on one. Jim mentioned the effects of otters in soft sediment systems. We had an opportunity with otters moving into an estuary in Central California, Elkhorn Slough, to look at ecological effects that otters might have in this system. So we initiated a study here as well. Again, an opportunistic experiment. There were no otters prior to the mid-1990s because of the fur trade. Otters just hadn't got there yet. Between 1995 and 2005, transient males used the slough, but they didn't do much feeding in the slough, and it was only around 2000 that females began to move in and the population began to experience intrinsic population growth with otters feeding in the slough. And in the first years, between 1999 and 2010, the diet was dominated by large cancer crabs, which had been very abundant in Elkhorn Slough. So this is mostly cancer, Productus cancer antenarius, and these are big, large crabs, over 15 to 20 centimeters carapace width. The otters ate a lot of these. You can see the decline in both catch per unit effort and in size class before and after otters were present. By 2010, pretty much all large crabs were gone. And this, it turned out, had a very dramatic and unexpected effect on the food web within Elkhorn Slough. It turned out, something we had not realized again until the crabs disappeared, but the crabs were limiting the abundance of mesograzers, largely isopods and sea hares, that fed on the algae growing on seagrass. With crabs gone, these mesograzers increased dramatically in abundance, and although we initially thought that might have a negative effect on seagrass, turns out that mainly they're grazing the epiphytic algae growing on the seagrass, and it actually made the seagrass a lot healthier. And in fact, there's been a 600% increase in seagrass biomass and also percent cover above ground and below ground biomass since otters moved back in. And currently, actually, some of the healthiest eelgrass beds on the west coast are now found in this nutrient-impaired habitat in Elkhorn Slough, where they were doing very poorly prior to sea otters going in. So this was a very unexpected food web interaction, and we're not sure how extrapolatable this might be to other estuaries. It may be. It probably depends on what the nutrient impairment of those estuaries is, because the nature of this food web interaction required that there be these epiphytic algae growing on the seagrass. As I mentioned, now there are virtually no large crabs left, and so sea otter diets have shifted since then to largely clams and small Pachygrapsis and Hemigrapsis shore crabs. That's these guys here, which are also super abundant in Elkhorn Slough, again because of the nutrient impairment. They thrive with this really nutrient-rich waters, and the banks of the slough are sort of like Swiss cheese tunnels of these super abundant small crabs, except in the tidal creeks that sea otters are using, where sea otters are beginning to limit the abundance of these crabs. And what we found is that as the shore crabs are reduced in abundance, you get much healthier pickleweed, and it also reduces bank erosion because it's because basically you have this great reduction in shore crabs that are tunneling and eating the rhizomes of the pickleweed. So we've been able to replicate this sea otter greening up effect in the tidal creeks that sea otters are not there by doing sea otter exclusions within this sea otter tidal creeks, and by doing procedural controls in areas that otters are not. And some of this is written up, some of this is being written up right now. So it appears that sea otters have, in California, also have these, the typical effects on urchins and other herbivores that lead to increased kelp abundance. This could be very important for Southern California as sea otters move into those areas. But they also have some really important food web interactions in other habitats, including seagrass habitats, where they appear that they can have really positive effects for eelgrass resilience, and also salt marsh areas where they may reduce spur and crabs and lead to healthier pickleweed and reduce bank erosion and marsh loss. So that's all we're going to say right now about indirect sea otter effects. We're going to switch now gears and talk about direct effects of sea otters on fisheries. And for this, we're going to talk about Southeast Alaska. I'm going to pass things over to Lori briefly, but I'm going to first cover some slides from Ginny Eckert, who has been, her and her students have been conducting studies on sea otter fisheries interactions in Southeast Alaska for some years. So As you're going to hear about shortly, sea otters do have really dramatic effects on certain prey species. And some of these are very commercially valuable prey species. So geoduck clams is a good example. When sea otters move into an area, you see a dramatic decrease in the abundance of geoduck clams, particularly the large commercially valuable geoduck clams. It is important, of course, to do controls. So this graph that you see here shows that there was a decline in areas with sea otters, but there was also a slight decline in areas without sea otters. And so without controls, it's very difficult to actually determine how much of a decline in a fishery you might be being driven by sea otters and how much might be being driven by other factors. So that's actually really important. The studies that Ginny and her students did were unique because they were looking not only at the effects on fisheries, but also simultaneously at tagged otters to see what the otters were eating, how this varied between areas, and also over time. And again, Jim had mentioned this. One of the unique things about sea otters is we can directly observe their foraging observation because they bring all their we can directly observe their foraging behavior because they bring all their prey up to the surface, and we can record what they're eating with these high-powered telescopes. So, not surprisingly, this is in an area that sea otters had recently colonized near Cake, Alaska, where most of this tagging work had happened. In this area, approximately 46% of the sea otters' diets consisted of commercially important species: Dungeness crab, red sea urchin, geoduck clams, sea cucumbers, and king crabs. The remaining 54% of the diet was made up by non-commercially important species. So that would suggest that sea otters are going to have a really big effect. However, that was in an area that sea otters had only recently recolonized. When similar foraging observations were then collected at other areas, one area where sea otters had been present for a long time, Coronation Island, which was colonized by otters very shortly after the reintroduction, and then Northwest Doll Island on the outer coast, an area that otters had also just arrived at. And at Coronation Island, it was found that only a very small proportion of the prey was commercially valuable species. Most of the diet was consisted of small prey, non-commercially fished prey, and that's because the energetically abundant prey had already been depleted, and so sea otters were at equilibrium at this area, feeding on smaller prey. At Northwest Doll Island, on the other hand, 99% of the diet consisted of urchins. And this sort of fits into this general trend. So these show dietary contributions of diet of commercially valuable or commercially fished species as a function of sea otter abundance or sea otter density, which is really a proxy for how long sea otters have been at the site. So at the far right of the graph here, you see where commercially important species are making up only a tiny percent of the diet. Those are areas that sea otters have been present at for a long time, whereas the areas that they're just arriving at, these commercially fished species tend to be the most energy rich, and that's what sea otters go for, and so those are the areas where sea otters are going to be having a dramatic effect in fisheries. Another quick note on butter clams. Another one of Ginny's students is looking at butter clam populations and dynamics and human and butter clam interactions. This shows the size distribution of areas of butter clams in areas with no sea otters. This shows the size distribution of clams in areas with sea otters. And you can see that, as Jim showed with Glacier Bay, sea otters have a dramatic effect on the prey, reducing the size distribution. However, there's some areas where sea otters and humans coexist, and that's one of them there. And you can see that there is a potential for sea otters and humans to coexist. So commercial species and diet are greatest early after colonization. The effect on subsistence clam populations, both abundance and size structure. Coexistence is possible but will be challenging and must account for the spatial structure of sea otter populations and the dynamic nature of their diet and interactions. And with that, we're going to switch to, Lori is going to tell us about some specific fisheries interaction examples.
Hello. Since we're almost out of our time window, I'm going to try and just jump right into this impacts on fisheries in Southeast Alaska. Next slide, please. So I'll give a little orientation of the fisheries that are in Southeast Alaska, the impact of those fisheries, and where the state sees some data gaps. Next slide, please. So we have fisheries in Southeast Alaska, both dive fisheries and crab fisheries. We have sea cucumber, geoduck, red sea urchin, which are our dive fisheries, and then we have a Dungeness crab, and then I will also move into talking a little bit about subsistence fisheries. But if we first address the commercial dive fisheries, There's 3 active fisheries. They require diving. They are individual shellfish are picked up by hand. They're managed with relatively small management areas, which there are multiple within the Southeast. The fisheries are managed with regular stock assessment surveys, and the data of these assessments are the basis for setting guideline harvest levels and monitoring population trends. Because these biomass estimates are required for every individual management area, they provided a nice time series for biomass, density, and size of these prey species. Next slide, please. We also have a strong subsistence fishery. There are a wide variety of species harvested, but the top 4 most commonly harvested by households that are commonly used among all the communities are Dungeness crab, clams, shrimp, and octopus. Traditionally, prior to the fur trade, subsistence on shellfish was managed by communities throughout the Southeast. There was a balance of hunting sea otters, as evident by middens, and utilizing shellfish. Otters and shellfish were successfully harvested and managed by villages so that they could coexist as a resource without depletion. Next slide. I'm going to show a series of maps that start with the past fisheries and move into the current fisheries areas. I'll start with those dive fisheries. This map shows the green, which is land, the orange and yellow for the sea cucumbers throughout pretty much most of Southeast Alaska, red for sea urchins, and blue for gooey ducks. These fisheries began in the 1990s, but developed substantially closer into the 2000s, and were producing new fishing grounds as the new fisheries were added. Note the diversity of red urchin and gooey ducks on the southwest corner of the map. This coverage is what is considered the peak best case scenario because it has the most active fisheries. Next slide. As we then move into active current fisheries area, you see that bottom west corner has lost a number of those fisheries areas. And if you click again, these are the areas that show the most effect from sea otters, in the blue outline. There have been closures of pretty much all of the sea urchin fisheries, most sea cucumbers, and a few gooey duck areas. As an example of the level of impact, the smaller upper blue circle on the left used to produce 13 million pounds of sea cucumbers per survey cycle, and within a 3-year survey cycle is down to 0. That's not a 0 harvest, that's actually a 0 abundance when they went out and did surveys. All 3 dive fishery populations continue to decline, and with each survey, commercial harvest opportunity is expected to drop. Next slide. This is just a map showing the areas that otters are present, as shown by the brown lines. We've already heard about otter expansion, and it's been discussed, but this just shows you a visual of that overlap with the fisheries. Next slide. These figures depict data on the fisheries for sea cucumber on top in yellow and gooey duck on bottom in blue. The y-axis is the number of fisheries areas. Note this is not abundance, but number of areas available for fishing. The x-axis is the date range for the abundance surveys. The black line are the guideline harvest levels. The red hash sections above the bars show where there are fisheries closure areas. As I stated, these numbers of fisheries areas grew in the 90s, but both fisheries peaked out about 2010, with fisheries area closures starting as early as 2005 and increasing with each season. There's a documented sharp decline in biomass in areas of sea otter occupation, as we expect the numbers of fisheries areas and harvest levels to continue to decline. Area closures are forcing fishery participants into smaller areas, causing increased fisheries competition. Next slide. This is another way to view the impact from otters on the fisheries. It's showing closures or declines. Each circle represents a whole fishery in the Southeast. In terms of areas affected, 39% sea cucumber, 66% of gooey ducks, 64% of red urchins have already rapidly declined or been closed. Since abalone are no longer an active fishery, they're not shown here, but abalone would have been a complete red circle with 100% closure. Sea otters are considered to be the greatest threat to the future of these fisheries. Next slide. As I mentioned, there's also a Dungeness crab fishery. It's Showing a similar map here with the blue and red representing commercial fisheries areas. The Dungeness crab fishery is likely impacted by sea otter predation, although for Alaska, we don't know the level of impact because there's not a Dungeness crab stock assessment or estimate of biomass. Otters are known to eat Dungeness crab, and there have been numerous reports by commercial fishermen of reduced biomass in areas that have been reoccupied by sea otters. Permit holders have been forced to relocate fishing grounds to areas where otters are not present, again causing greater fishing intensity in smaller areas. Although it's not currently impacted, it's likely that red and blue king crab fisheries will be impacted if there's future northward expansion of sea otters. Next slide. Now we'll move into subsistence fisheries area, again, a similar regional map, where the blue areas show where customary and traditional uses of shellfish species are recognized. Next slide. This map shows pink areas, similar, overlaying the blue of the previous slide, and it shows the harvest levels for 6 communities from 2012 and 13. The current harvests are focused into smaller areas in closer proximity to communities. These are represented because of a decline in shellfish available, as well as communities choosing to fish closer to home in areas that are cheap and safer to get to. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier the traditional pre-fur trade management of subsistence fisheries. Now we look at contemporary harvest. Currently, there is some trial and error by some tribes to test otter restrictions in areas by hunting otters, and then the impact on the shellfish and other kelp and fish species. It's unknown if restriction of otters out of an area requires consistent hunting or a directed focused hunt. The tribes are also concerned that there's no enforcement mechanism for hunters that are not associated with their own tribe. And there's concern that management is not active. For instance, there's a Sea Otter and Sea Lion Commission, but they have not been actively engaged in sea otter work for some time. Next slide. Hunting otters has long been part of subsistence. When addressing the issue from an otter perspective, there are limiting factors that include concern for hunting enforcement. There's no definition of Indian, Aleut, or Eskimo in the MMPA. There's the challenge of immediate cost, fuel, ammunition, and tanning with a very delayed benefit. There's limited availability of skin sewers, and there's limited market for handicrafts. From the subsistence shellfish perspective, limiting factors include declining shellfish harvest, of course, effects on species-specific areas, which I'll show in the next slide, and secondary effects such as commercial fisheries moving into subsistence areas. Next slide. This figure shows impact of per capita harvest on marine invertebrates over the past 30 years based on door-to-door household surveys in 7 villages. The colored bars represent the year of the survey, starting in 1984, which is blue, to the end in 2012, which is yellow. In all locations except Haines, the harvest that are most recent have declined in the surveys. Haines is the only location without a decline in the most recent survey, but otters are not currently in abundance there. But even Haines is concerned for the future, and they're seeing the impact of commercial fisheries moving into their subsistence regions as resources become limited elsewhere. Next slide. And then in conclusion, we just have some areas of data gaps that are existing. The primary gaps include unknown shellfish recovery time after depletion from otters. Some resurveys of sea cucumber areas have shown no recovery following at least a 7-year period that has been occupied by sea otters when sea otters are still present. Little is known about Dungeness crabs, and therefore impact from otters is poorly understood. As has already been stated, a sea otter census is out of date, and current regional numbers are needed, as well as an understanding of how they'll be managed once OSP is reached. And then a question that Fish and Game is grappling with is, are shellfish fisheries sustainable with the current trajectories of sea otter growth? Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie. I was going to say, on that uplifting note, if we'd like to have the other panel members come up to the table, I think we'll have everyone up here before we take questions. So we have Patrick Lemons, Mike Miller. Here we go, Grant. Yeah. Thank you, panel members. What I might ask you to do, each of the four of you, is maybe if you could just, I could just give you your name and affiliation, but perhaps could you give just a sentence or two on your interest in sea otter populations and recovery from your agency's perspective, just so the audience knows where you're coming from, please. So just hold the button down.
My name is Patrick Lemons. I'm the chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Marine Mammals Management Office in Anchorage, Alaska. I think my interest in this is fairly obvious. We're the management agency, or the agency responsible for management of sea otters throughout Alaska.
Thanks. My name is Mike Miller. I'm actually the chairman of the statewide hunters organizations, the co-management group, but specifically the sea otters. I'm from Sitka, on the Sitka Tribal Council, and I've worked on sea otter issues there since around 2000.
And I'm Dan Ayers again, and I'm the Coastal Shellfish Manager for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and obviously our agency is excited about sea otter recovery on the North Washington coast as far as our marine mammal staff is concerned, and the shellfish biologist in me is concerned about sea otter recovery on the North Washington coast. And we do have some indication of impacts on Dungeness crab fisheries and our razor clam fishery as those populations recover.
My name is Grant Hildebrand, and I'm the chief of the Marine Ecosystem Office for the USGS at the Alaska Science Center. So I work with USGS also. We're the research arm of the Department of Interior. Work with Tim and Jim, and we're looking to understanding what the research needs are going forward and how we can play a role in helping to meet those needs.
Thank you so much for being here and providing a variety of perspectives on these issues. So we are ready to take questions.
Sorry, Francis,
Sorry.
just a quick reminder, Lillian and Laurie are also participating on the panel remotely, so if anybody has questions specifically for them, they're online and ready to answer.
And if you remember, Lillian Carswell gave a presentation looking a little bit like Tim Tinker from California. Jason?
Yeah, so for the last couple of days, we've heard a lot about oceanographic changes and some profound impacts that we're seeing. Really, the oceanographic changes were varied, but from 2014 to 2016, maybe best characterized by really strong positive PDO. We heard about unusual mortality events with Galapagos fur seals and California sea lions that were already in an UME, but it peaked in 2015. We had this huge jump in whale entanglements because whales came to places where they weren't, and the fishery happened to be concentrated in that area. Harmful algal blooms, and a big influx of California sea lions into the Columbia River. And you guys in the California current have got a really amazing handle on the ecological interactions with otters, and I just wondered if you saw any effects coincident with this in the otters.
Speak to that a little bit. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes, and to elaborate, we did, and in fact, I think the explosion in urchin abundance is directly related to those. I just mentioned the sea star wasting because we think we have a study going on in Monterey right now that does suggest that was a primary factor, but it also undoubtedly related to changes in the recruitment dynamics of urchins, both enhanced retainment of larvae and such. So those, ironically, compared to all those negative effects that you just mentioned, actually led to an unexpected increase in a primary food source for sea otters. A key difference, of course, between sea otters and all those other species is that they're operating in really a fundamentally different food web. They're not in they don't eat any fish, so they're entirely in the invertebrate food web and determined by things that affect productivity of invertebrates. There's also a lag because most of the invertebrates they eat are usually many years old. They only eat the larger ones. So any sort of oceanographic signal often has about a 5-year lag before it gets into sea otters. But that said, Some of those, the algal blooms, the domoic acid in particular, did have negative effects in sea otters. The signal demographically was swamped by the increase in food, but we actually did see very high levels of domoic acid intoxication and some of the secondary infections that can lead to cardiomyopathy as a sort of an ultimate byproduct of earlier life domoic acid exposure. So we have been actually, I didn't mention those things because there's so many things to mention, but we did see a signal of some of those disease-related things in sea otters. And those probably are going to become more important once this current short-term glut of urchins, or relatively short-term glut of urchins, it's not going to last. Urchins will not remain abundant that long. And when that happens, there's probably going to be a pretty substantial correction in abundance, and things like those disease mortality will become probably really big over the next few years.
Actually, since I'm up here, I can grab the mic. One thing we're interested in this session is sort of cross-pollination between California and Southeast. So to follow up on that, there now are increasing harmful algal blooms in Southeast Alaska. Are there lessons from California that would be applicable to Southeast as far as monitoring, data gaps, issues to be aware of?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Otters are, as with many marine mammals, very susceptible to some, to toxic algal blooms. Domoic acid blooms particularly seem to have long-term chronic effects. They're really hard to detect. There's less of the acute mortality that you see with sea lions, although that does happen in extreme cases. But what we've been able to do, particularly by following tagged animals over many years, is document that there are long-term reductions in survival that are the result of earlier life exposure to domoic acid. So these sorts of chronic effects are really hard to measure, and took years and years of data in California before we could really do that. I guess I'm not exactly sure how that will be translatable, because those types of studies are very expensive and difficult to do logistically, even in a place like California. But just to be aware that otters are highly susceptible because they eat such large amounts of shellfish. They are susceptible to the toxins that are in those shellfish and to the disease parasites as well, like Sarcocystis neurona and Toxoplasma gondii.
Mike, do you want to comment?
Well, just to say that we haven't really in Southeast been looking that close at it, although we do have, in Sitka actually, started a network with all the tribes in Southeast, so we're doing weekly harmful algal bloom monitoring, so at least we have a couple of years of data at this point that we can start looking back, I guess, or if it starts becoming an issue, we at least have the network in place to start making the connection if that's the case.
Robin?
I'm curious if there's, in Oregon, whether there's any actual efforts to monitor sea otter populations. You mentioned basically, Deanna, that they're really not there, but every time I go to Northern Oregon, I see sea otters. So it seems like they, the question is anyone looking, and are the types of studies to start to assess what sort of ecological effects they may have as the populations grow, particularly given the very high growth rates in central and southern Washington?
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of effort going on. It's pretty much random reports that we get for our sea otters there, because it's individuals, it's not groups of otters that seem to be moving into Oregon so far. There is an interest in relocating otters into Oregon, though. There's a group out of Newport, Oregon, that wants to reintroduce otters into Oregon. But that's a beginning in the processes, and they have a lot of work to do, so I think there will be some beginning data collected on ecological impacts, and then if they actually do get otters there, then post after that. But right now, there's probably not enough otters to be making a huge impact on the ecosystem in Oregon yet.
Yeah, just one follow-up. I think the last time I went to Manzanita, I think I saw a group of 5 just sitting there watching the water. So it seems like there might be more if no one's really looking. So.
Well, most of that area is National Wildlife Refuge, and they do kind of keep track of all of that stuff.
Well, I guess I'd go straight to one of the big questions in the room, which is with respect to Southeast Alaska. we're seeing a conflict between sea otters and both, sounds like, traditional and commercial harvest. I guess I'd ask the folks who haven't had a chance to talk, what research or action sort of are the next steps? Where are we going with this, and how can the commission help with that?
Start at this end.
Yeah, that's a great question, obviously. We actually have been recently having conversations with most of the panel, some of those folks on the phone and those folks not in the room, about having a meeting of scientists and stakeholders here sometime in the near future. I mean, it's complicated with summertime and commercial fishing going on. My hope is maybe sometime in the fall or early winter to hold a workshop to bring all the stakeholders into the room, talk through the science and the information we have, and explore what options under the MMPA we may have. And then I think as far as information needs, I think Lori clearly pointed out that the current population estimate for Southeast Alaska is pretty critical. My office is planning on doing that in the next year or two, depending upon funding. We're kind of in a 5-year cycle approximately, about every time we survey Southeast as we rotate through the 3 stocks we manage in Alaska. And probably modernizing the way in which we estimate population size for otters in Southeast. There's some new technology out there using photographic-based methods and different types of aerial survey methods for better population estimation and maybe more effective or cheaper as well. So that would be a pretty critical information need for us.
I guess from our perspective, of course, we're dealing with a lot of the fallout, I guess, of like the report that Lori gave, of all the impacts on both commercial and subsistence shell fisheries. And we're kind of having to balance a little bit because there's a lot of drastic proposals that are being proposed, I guess, to open up the act or make some big changes to essentially use the native exemption for hunting as a predator control scheme. What we're looking at closer right now is something that happened in Sitka through what we called a sustainable arts project that we worked with the regional corporation, Sea Alaska Heritage, to teach some skin sewing and provide furs that were purchased from areas of high abundance, including Sitka. That was starting in 2012 through 2014. It wasn't directed towards bringing back any shellfish, but at first glance, it appears that starting in 2016, we started seeing in abundance, on a smaller scale at least, of things that we thought were gone, including abalone, gumboot chitons, and red urchins. So the next step for us, I think, is to work to document the harvest, because there's tagging data on all the animals that were harvested there, and try to make a correlation, if there is one, between the reappearance of these important both commercial and subsistence shellfish and what kind of scale that is. If there is a strong connection, I think we're interested in looking at another community, maybe with a little bit different demographics, and try to focus a hunt in that area. The interesting thing is we didn't have to take all the otters out. There was no plan to do that, but it seemed to have an impact if this holds true. So that's the next steps for us.
Sorry.
I guess for the Alaska Science Center, a lot of our most recent work has been focused in Southwest Alaska, the Alaska Peninsula, and also Gulf of Alaska. But we've recently reinitiated work in Glacier Bay, and so some of our capacity is moving towards Southeast. And so I think what we're really interested in is participating and listening to those discussions that Patrick is talking about to get an idea of what are the most pressing needs going forward to address some of these questions. And as Tim and Jim did a nice job of describing, there's lots of different things to look at relative to sea otters. You can look at abundance estimates, how many are there right now, demographics, what do the trends look like going forward, and then also some of these ecological processes and how that can affect both fisheries but ecosystem as a whole. So I think for us, really, we just want to be engaged in those conversations and figure out what role do we have and what other partnerships can we facilitate.
So I had several talking about sea otter census and populations, and one point that I really learned from these two was the patchiness of otter distribution and importance of that decay. So I'm thinking about this idea of removing otters or translocation. So again, are there lessons to be learned from California about patchiness of otters and trying to do different things in having places that are basically fisheries are a priority versus otters are a priority? I don't know if you'd like to, all of you, comment on that. I mean, just to clear it up. Oh, I don't, yeah.
That has been, yes, so that has been part of the conversation, and I think would be a key subject for the workshop that Patrick mentioned that we would like to convene. Again, that would bring together, we envision a fairly broad base of stakeholders, tribal entities, fisheries, scientists, even archaeologists and other disciplines that might have some insights into how coexistence might work. And it's very definitely going to incorporate that patchiness that you mentioned. I think what Mike was just describing in Sitka Sound is actually a great example of that. Relatively limited amount of harvest in that. It was substantial enough, but as he mentioned, it wasn't like a whole-scale removal of all otters. But otters do have these behavioral responses, and those responses can be, tend to be contained in a relatively small area. So outer Sitka Sound is still very kelp dominant, but right around where the harvests have been is now the shellfish are becoming more abundant. So I think there is a potential, but we're just at the earliest stages of figuring that out. So the workshop that Patrick mentioned would be sort of a first stab at beginning to tease out what kind of new directions in sea otter conservation and management might look like, incorporating the human dimension.
I'm wondering if Laurie or Lillian wanted to comment. No, I'm looking at Sam because she's there. Daryl?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on Mike Miller's comments. So if there's a program for training for crafts and increase otter hunting, I heard Laurie say that there's a problem with market for otter stuff. So what would be the market? Is there a way to increase that market?
Well, what we faced oftentimes for the people that do handicrafts is they often sell them into an Alaska market, which is several years of sewing, and that seems to get saturated at some point. The project that we did specifically was a 3-year project of teaching people to sew and then working with them. The 3rd year actually was marketing to places where we've gone south in the U.S. and had tremendous demand for product. Unfortunately, the funding got cut in the year 3, and so we really didn't get into the marketing phase. So that's, if we replicate this again, it's going to be an important part of helping. There is a high demand actually in the lower 48. It's just a matter of getting the product from people in the villages to somebody that can carry it to those markets. So we can do it. We're almost there, but next steps will be trying to restart at that point.
I'd be interested if anyone in the group could say something about both British Columbia and Russia, and whether similar fisheries and similar conflicts and interactions and uses of otters are going on there or anticipated there?
Yes, you're closest to Russia.
Relative to Russia, I don't know the answer to that question. I would suspect my colleagues over here that have a lot longer history of working in this arena may have a better idea, possibly in Russia. British Columbia, I would certainly look to you guys for that. But I do know that recent reports out of Russia suggest that, Commander Islands are starting to experience declines similar to the far western Aleutians. And most of the evidence suggests that likely is continued killer whale predation. But relative to fisheries, we haven't heard any reports about fisheries conflicts with sea otters in that area from our Russian colleagues.
I can speak a little bit about British Columbia, since I'm now back in Canada. I'm working with some colleagues there out of Simon Fraser University and UBC. who are working, Ann Solomon in particular, who has a Pew Fellowship and is working with all the coastal tribes, actually. We've been having discussions with them that exactly mirror these discussions that we've been having with Southeast Alaska. The same phenomenon are happening. There is not a provision in the Canadian Endangered Species Act for handicraft-type subsistence harvests, but nonetheless, informal harvests have happened, and some of the tribes, particularly on the western coast of Vancouver Island, are finding similar phenomenon that Mike described for Sitka, and they're exploring those ideas. So there's really a great interest in British Columbia in solving these same challenges, and we were thinking that it would be very difficult to have an international meeting, but it might be productive because the same challenges are being faced in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska and other areas as well. And so not reinventing the wheel twice might be productive. I'm not sure how that would look on the ground, but it's something I know there is great interest in British Columbia as well.
This question is for Tim. The network of California marine protected areas has been in place for about 10 years in Central California. And you mentioned Elkhorn Slough, but I'm wondering more generally, how do you think this is affecting population dynamics and ecological interactions?
That's a great question. In some of there are independent studies by PISCO and some of the other groups that have very definitely documented positive effects for some prey species. And so while it's very difficult to draw a direct cause and effect relationship between that and a demographic response by sea otters, it's undoubtable that it cannot be doubted that the increases in the prey are going to eventually be a positive thing for sea otters. But the more concrete answer to that is we don't know in terms of how the ecological interactions are being affected. I think it's an area that's ripe for research. Part of the challenge is that we have these large oceanographic changes that have happened simultaneously. The sea star wasting disease was an enormous one, and that signal kind of wipes out everything else right now in Central California. For most of the MPA areas, all of a sudden, otters are back to eating urchins again, like they were 40 years ago. So it's a great question, but we don't think we have an answer for it.
We're running short on time. Are there questions from the audience? Vera, I'm sorry. Yeah.
This question. We've had some issues. Well, what happened in Bering Straits with biotoxins and harmful algal bloom, maybe on walruses and ice seal. The issue that we have is collecting samples and where to ship them right away. I understand Sitka tribe has testing capabilities for maybe shellfish for biotoxin. Is that something that we could collaborate with the tribe about sending our samples maybe to Sitka to get them tested right away for as a health concern?
Right, that's actually something that we are working on. We just, I think last week, had a meeting both with Coeric, Kotzebue, and North Slope Borough representatives to expand that and at least get some baseline information. But we're just seeing so many changes in the ecosystem overall. I guess it's good to have that in place, and hopefully we can at least be collecting data around the state and work with some of the existing networks that are in place as well. So we're working on it.
So really just to emphasize that question, you would have capacity? This issue's come up several times, and a concern from which agency would take responsibility for screening shellfish from a walrus's stomach, because it's now no longer it's stomach contents and it's shellfish, and the concern is really human health, not the marine mammal health. But it sounds like you're offering a solution that could be
We do
really
have
helpful.
a functioning lab at this point that
Yeah.
is taking samples, yes. I think we started with a whale that washed up last year, and that was the first marine mammal tissues we work with, but yeah, it's in place.
Thank you.
Very quickly, going back to Lillian on the phone, she did want to interject on one of the earlier questions, and we've had some technical difficulties with the sound. Lillian, are you there? Do you want to say something still, or?
Sure, I'm here, and sorry for the to go back to something that was already discussed, but Francis was asking about the idea of having this patchwork of areas where sea otters are supposed to be present and areas where sea otters are supposed to be absent. And I'll just say that some of the discussion has focused on, focusing tribal harvest in particular small local areas. So that's a really different question from what we have in California, because there's no native harvest of otters allowed in California. So we did have a zonal management program put in place in connection with the translocation program to San Nicolas Island. Sea otters were allowed to be in the translocation zone, but there was a very large no otter zone that surrounded that area that encompassed all of Southern California that was required to be kept otter-free by capture and removal. And I will just say that that is not at all a viable solution. So I would just recommend that no one try to go down that road again. And I'm happy to share all the details with anyone who is curious.
Thank you, Lillian, and I'm sure you'll be at the workshop later this year to ensure that doesn't happen. We are running out of time. Yes, we are running out of time, so I'm going to cut it off here unless there's any burning questions from the floor. I don't see any smoke. So, well, finally, I would like to thank the panel and our speakers. And it sounds like this workshop will be a really important path forward for Southeast. So I'll offer the Commission's support in any way that we can help with that. And then finally, I also would really like to thank Vicky Cornish, who did a fantastic job of organizing the panel, setting you up for questions. And Vicky couldn't be here today, so she might be listening in. So thank you, Vicky, if you're there, for a great job. And we now have a break.